Some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Mimi Goodman.
And I'm Nermeen Sheikh. Welcome to our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. A new expose in Wired magazine has revealed new details about how the National Security Agency is quietly building the largest spy center in the country in Bluffdale, Utah, as part of a secret NSA surveillance program codenamed Stellar Wind. According to investigative reporter James Bamford, the NSA has established listening posts throughout the nation to collect and sift through billions of email messages and phone calls, whether they originate within the country or overseas. The Utah Spy Center will contain near-bottomless databases to store all forms of communication collected by the agency. This includes the complete contents of private emails, cell phone calls, and Google searches, as well as all sorts of personal data trails, parking receipts, travel itineraries, bookstore purchases, and other digital pocket litter.
In addition, the NSA has also created a supercomputer of almost unimaginable speed to look for patterns and unscramble codes. James Bamford writes, this secret surveillance program is in some measure the realization of the total information awareness program created during the first term of the Bush administration, but later killed by Congress in 2003 due to privacy concerns and public outcry. James Bamford joins us now from London, England. His article in Wired is called "The NSA is Building the Country's Biggest Spy Center. Watch What You Say." Jim Bamford is an investigative journalist who's been covering the National Security Agency for the last 3 decades. He came close to standing trial after revealing the NSA's operations in an explosive 1982 book called The Puzzle Palace. His latest book is the last in his trilogy on the NSA. It's called The Shadow Factory, the ultra-secret NSA from 9/11 to the eavesdropping on America. James Bamford, welcome to Democracy Now! Your piece is so dramatic. I was wondering if you might read the first few paragraphs as we begin.
I'll give it a try. The spring air in the small, sand-dusted town has a soft haze to it, and clumps of green-gray sagebrush rustle in the breeze. Bluffdale sits in a bowl-shaped valley in the shadow of Utah's Watchet Range and to the east, the Oquirrh Mountains to the west. It's the heart of Mormon country, where religious pioneers first arrived more than 160 years ago. They came to escape the rest of the world, to understand the mysterious words sent down from their God as revealed on buried golden plates, and to practice what has become known as the principle, marriage to multiple wives. Today, Bluffdale is home to one of the nation's largest sects of polygamists, the Apostolic United Brethren, with upwards of 9,000 members. The Brethren's complex includes a chapel, a school, a sports field, and an archive. Membership has doubled since 1978, and the number of plural marriages has tripled. So the sect has recently been looking for ways to purchase more land and expand throughout the town. But new pioneers have quietly begun moving into the area, secretive outsiders who say little and keep to themselves. Like the pious polygamists, they are focused on deciphering cryptic messages that only they have the power to understand. Just off Beef Hollow Road, less than a mile from Brethren headquarters, thousands of hard-hatted construction workers in sweat-soaked T-shirts are laying the groundwork for the newcomer's own temple and archive, a massive complex so large that it necessitated expanding the town's boundaries. Once built, it will be more than 5 times the size of the U.S. Capitol. Rather than Bibles, prophets, and worshipers, this temple will be filled with servers, computer intelligence experts, and armed guards. And instead of listening for words flowing down from heaven, these newcomers will be secretly capturing, storing, and analyzing vast quantities of words and images hurling through the world's telecommunications networks. In the little town of Bluffdale, Big Love and Big Brother have become uneasy neighbors.
And those are the opening words of Jim Bamford's piece, "The NSA is Building the Country's Biggest Spy Center. Watch What You Say." So, James Bamford, it's good to have you on, albeit from Britain right now. But talk further about what you have found and what the capacity of this data center, as they call it, seemingly so innocuous, is.
Well, it's going to be 1 million square feet. That's gigantic. There's only one data center in the country that's larger, and it's only slightly larger than that. And it's going to cost $2 billion. It's being built in this area on a military base outside of Salt Lake City in Bluffdale. As I said, they had to actually extend the boundary of the town so it would fit into it. And the whole purpose of this is the centerpiece of this massive eavesdropping complex, this network that was created after 9/11. During the 90s, the NSA had a disastrous decade following the Cold War. They missed the first World Trade Center bombing. They missed the attack on the USS Cole. They missed the attack on the U.S. embassies in East Africa. And finally, they missed the 9/11 attacks. So NSA wanted to pretty much recreate itself as this massive eavesdropping organization that was, during the Cold War, focused on the Soviet Union primarily, and to some degree the Eastern Europe and China and Cuba, communist countries. And today it's focused on anybody that could use a piece of communication, because the terrorists that they're eventually after use the same kind of communications that everybody else does. So it has to focus on the worldwide network of communications, the same network that all of us use. So you have this massive agency that's collecting a tremendous amount of information every day by satellites, by tapping into undersea cables, by picking up microwave links and tapping into cell phones and data links and your computer email links and so forth. And then it has to store it someplace, and that's why they built Bluffdale. And then that acts as, in essence, like a cloud, a digital cloud, so that agency employees, analysts from around the country at NSA headquarters and their listing posts in different parts of the U.S., in Georgia, Texas, Hawaii, and Colorado, can all access that information held in Bluffdale in that data center. And that's pretty much a summary of what that data center is all about.
James Bamford, can you explain also for, I think most people are more familiar with the work of the CIA or the FBI or other intelligence agencies. The NSA is the most secretive. So can you say a little about what the work they do, how that's different from what the other agencies do?
Sure. The NSA is much different from the CIA. First of all, it's about 3 times the size. It costs far more. It's tremendously more secret than the CIA, and what it does is very different. It's focused on eavesdropping, on tapping into major communications links, on listening to what people around the world and to some degree in the United States say on telephones, email, communications. That's really the high point of intelligence these days. Human intelligence is what the CIA does. It goes out and recruits spies, or it blows people up with drones. So the actual collection, and human intelligence hasn't really been very good historically. Most of the intelligence that the U.S. gathers comes from NSA. It's from tapping into communications. So that's a very big difference between the two, and NSA is really the most powerful intelligence agency, not only in the U.S., but in the world today.
One of the things that you also mention, one of the key functions that this new facility will undertake is has to do with the advanced encryption standard. Can you say a little about that and why it's important?
Well, yeah, the other purpose, in addition to storing material, is it plays a major role in the code-breaking aspects of NSA. NSA has several missions. One of them is intercepting communications. The other is breaking codes, because a lot of that information is encrypted. And the third function of NSA is making codes for the U.S., encrypting U.S. communications. So Bluffdale will play a major role in the breaking of codes, because for breaking codes you really need two key ingredients. One is a very large a place where you can store a very large amount of material, because the more material you have, when you're going through it, using computers to go through it, what you're looking for is patterns. And the more material that you have, the more data, the more telephone calls, the more email, the more encrypted data that you have, the more patterns that you're likely to discover. And the second thing you need is a very, very powerful computer, a very fast computer that can go through enormous amounts of information very fast, looking for those patterns. And so the NSA is now also building a very secret facility down in Tennessee at Oak Ridge, where during World War II the U.S. In great secrecy developed the atomic bomb as part of the Manhattan Project. So now instead of an atomic bomb, you have a massive computer that the NSA is working on to be the fastest computer in the world, with speeds that are just beyond most people's comprehensions. And the reason for that is because they have to use these computers to do what they call brute force. In other words, take this data and just go through it as fast as possible, just to look for these key patterns.
We're talking to James Bamford, investigative reporter who's covered the National Security Agency for more than 3 decades. His piece in Wired magazine that we're going to continue with after break is called "The NSA is Building the Country's Biggest Spy Center. Watch What You Say." He's speaking to us from Britain. This is Democracy Now! We'll be back with Jim Bamford in a minute, and we will also be joined later by Thomas Drake. If there was a trial, Jim Bamford might have testified at the trial of Thomas Drake, an NSA whistleblower. Stay with us.
You have understood the riddles of the ages. Yes, and you have understood the universal mind. You have placed your footprints on the everlasting sands of time. Yeah, so tell me why can't you understand that there ain't no such thing as a Superman? There ain't no such thing as a Superman. You was on it now. You went to see great Egypt fall. It fell down to the ground. Yes, and you was out there on the corner.
Late, great Gil Scott-Heron here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
Yesterday, Democratic Congressman Hank Johnson of Georgia questioned NSA Director and Cybercom Commander General Keith Alexander about reports that the NSA is intercepting U.S. citizens' phone calls and emails. Johnson specifically refers to your article, Jim Bamford. Let's go to that clip.
The general article in Wired magazine reported this month that a whistleblower formerly employed by the NSA has stated NSA signals intercepts include, quote, eavesdropping on domestic phone calls and inspection of domestic emails, end quote. Is that true?
No, not in that context. The question that, or I think what he's trying to raise is, are we gathering all the information on the United States? No, that is not correct.
The author of the Wired magazine article, his name is James Bashford. He writes that NSA has software that, quote, searches U.S. sources for target addresses, locations, countries, and phone numbers, as well as watch-listed names, keywords, and phrases in email. Any communication that arouses suspicion, especially those to or from the million or so people on the agency watch lists, are automatically copied or recorded and then transmitted to the NSA. Is this true?
No, it's not.
That was NSA Director General Keith Alexander being questioned by Georgia Congressman Hank Johnson. James Bamford, your response.
Well, you know, the NSA has constantly denied that they're doing things, and then it turns out they are doing these things. They denied they were doing domestic eavesdropping back in the 70s, and it turned out they had Operation Shamrock and Operation Minaret, and they've been reading every single telegram coming in or going out of the country for 30 years at that point, and also eavesdropping on anti-war veterans. That came out during the Church Committee report. More recently, a few years ago, President Bush said before camera that the United States is not eavesdropping on anybody without a warrant. And then it turns out we had this exposure to all the warrantless eavesdropping, the New York Times article. And so you have this constant denial and parsing of words in terms of what he's saying. So what I would like to do, quote from a number of people in the article that are whistleblowers. They worked at NSA. They worked there many years. One of my key whistleblowers was the senior technical person on the largest eavesdropping operation in NSA. He was a very senior NSA official. He was in charge of basically automating the entire world eavesdropping network for NSA. So, and one of the other people is a intercept operator that was actually listening to these calls, listening to journalists calling from overseas and talking to their wives and having intimate conversations. And she tells about how these people were having these conversations, and she felt very guilty listening to them. These people came forward and said, you know, this shouldn't be happening. Bill Benny, the senior official I interviewed, had been with NSA for 40 years almost, and he left saying that what they're doing is unconstitutional. What I'd like to see is, why don't we have a panel for the first time in history of some of these people and have them before Congress, sitting there telling their story to Congress instead of to me, and then have NSA respond to them. I mean, this is the American public who we're talking about, whose phone calls we're talking about. So, and email and data searches and all that. So I think it's about time that the Congress get involved instead of asking questions from a newspaper or from a magazine article, and start actually questioning these people on the record in terms of what they're doing and how they're doing it and to whom they're doing it, you know, to whom they're doing it.
We're talking to James Bamford, longtime reporter on intelligence activities in this country, has been doing it for more than 30 years, been covering the National Security Agency, a top-secret agency far bigger than the CIA. Jim Bamford, you referred to some of your whistleblowers, and in 2008, I spoke with retired Army Sergeant Adrienne Kinney here on Democracy Now!, who revealed she was personally ordered to eavesdrop on Americans working for news organizations and NGOs in Iraq. Take a lesson.
After 9/11, when we were mobilized and given this new mission, it was very starting something from the bottom up. And it was really striking that in intercepting all these satellite phone communications, the majority of the traffic was not Arabic. It was languages beyond our translation capabilities. We would get Chinese, Japanese, Tagalog, Tajik, a lot of Dari, Persian, Pashto, some minimal Arabic, but really not that much. And so we would just go through this process of going through and identifying who belonged to what. And as we began to identify different phone numbers which belong to these humanitarian aid organizations and journalists, we actually had the capability to block those phone numbers from being intercepted. But due to guidance given to our officer in charge, we did not do that.
That was retired Army Sergeant Adrienne Kinney, who was here in the United States eavesdropping on the Palestine hotel, which was later bombed. She said she saw a piece of paper that showed that the Palestine hotel was going to be bombed and went to her superiors and said, "You're bombing the hotel where I am listening to the people inside, and I can tell you that they are journalists." Jim Bamford, you quote Adrienne in your piece as well, in your piece in Wired magazine, called "The NSA is Building the Country's Biggest Spy Center." Watch what you say, Jim.
Yes, I first interviewed Adrienne for my book, The Shadow Factory, a number of years ago, and she's extremely credible, and these are people just like Bill Benny that aren't speaking to me confidentially. They're speaking to me on the record, and they're risking jail, basically, to tell the country what's going on. So these people have a great deal of courage and a great deal of credibility, and that's why I think that the NSA owes them and owes the country a duty to come out and say what they're doing. I mean, this is a democracy, as your program often says, and I think the public should really have at least a fair insight into what the government is doing with their communications.
One of the most extraordinary things about the eavesdropping program is the number of languages that people are at the NSA are eavesdropping on. Can you say a little about what kind of linguistic ability the people who are listening in have?
Well, the NSA was always very hurting for linguistic capabilities, especially in the lead up to 9/11, so they had very few people that spoke Pashtun or Dari, the languages in Afghanistan. They had very much an insufficient number of people who spoke Arabic, and Adrienne Kinney was telling me how they had an instructor down in Georgia, where she was working for NSA, trying to teach rudimentary Pashtun, I think it was, to some of the people, but it was very hard for them to pick it up. So there's 7,000 languages in the world, and NSA is, that's one of the very difficult things NSA has. It's trying to understand what people are saying. Picking up the information, intercepting it, is far less difficult than understanding what they're saying.
In response to your article, Jim Bamford, Forbes magazine published a piece yesterday by Lauren Thompson of the Lexing Institute called "NSA's Secret Data Center is a Threat, but Only to America's Enemies." The author writes, quote, "The real reason the intelligence community needs big cryptological and analytic complexes is that modern information technology has empowered hostile states and extremists of every stripe, giving them unprecedented access to the sources of American strength, while enabling them to thoroughly obscure the authors and content of their communications." James Bamford, your comment.
Well, listen, I mean, I wrote another book called Pretext for War, about how we got into the Iraq War, and I've been hearing this fear-mongering forever. We're spending enormous amounts of money on NSA to pick up communications. And even though they lost all these, they had all these failures during the 1990s, you know, failure after failure. The World Trade Center 1 and World Trade Center 2, the attack on the Cole, the East African embassies bombings, and even after they started all this rebuilding and more money, they still missed the person flying over on the Christmas Day flight to Detroit with a bomb in his underwear, and they missed the person in Times Square. So, you know, all this eavesdropping we're doing and all this money we're spending, I don't see an awful lot of value coming out of that, but I do hear tremendous amounts of fear-mongering, that sort of nonstop fear-mongering from the people that are pushing this agenda.
Well, one of the things that you've raised in the past has to do with the way in which the NSA worked with the telecommunications industry here in the U.S. to eavesdrop on American citizens. But they apparently outsourced the eavesdropping, I mean, the relationship between the NSA and the telecommunications companies to a third party. Can you say a little bit about who that third party was, who those companies were, and where they were based?
Yeah, the two of the companies that were heavily involved, one of them was NARIS. It was a company that has been since bought by Boeing. It was a company formed in Israel by Israelis, and then it ran its company from California. But the NSA, or I guess it was AT&T that basically hired them, and or NSA, maybe the two of them working together, but the bottom line was NARIS provided the equipment that NSA was using in the AT&T facilities. AT&T had this big switch in San Francisco, and it would be using this NARIS equipment that would take the information from the wires coming in, the cables coming in, and then route it to NSA, the information that NSA wanted. So it used this company called NARIS, and again, it's a company that had been formed overseas, and you really have to start wondering when you have companies that were formed in foreign countries, and they're giving such intimate access to U.S. telecommunications, especially very secret U.S. work. The other company was Verint, and they do a lot of the monitoring for Verizon. And Verint also was formed in Israel by Israelis. And it turns out that the chairman and founder of the company ended up being a fugitive now from the United States, wanting on multiple counts of fraud and theft and so forth. He's hiding out in Namibia and Africa now. And then two other members of the general counsel and another senior executive from the parent company, Converse, was also arrested and charged in the theft and pleaded guilty. So you have the problem of these companies that are actually doing the very sensitive work of monitoring everybody's communications. You have real questions about them, let alone the people that the NSA is targeting.
Jim Bamford, you have been writing about the NSA for decades. It's interesting speaking to you in London. We usually speak to you in the United States. You're sitting right along the Thames, across the river from MI6, from British intelligence agencies as we speak. But as you unveil this story in Wired magazine about this small place, or obscure until now place, Bluffdale, Utah, right near the Four Corners where, you know, Colorado and New Mexico, Utah and Arizona hit on the map there in the southwest of the United States. I can't help but think about how you came close to standing trial in 1982 for your book on the NSA, The Puzzle Palace, revealing what was going on with the NSA. Are you at all concerned about what it means to reveal this information?
Well, as you mentioned, I've been doing it for 30 years, so I've had, you know, concerns about that from time to time. In 1982, as you mentioned, I didn't come close to trial because I was never arrested or prosecuted or anything, but I was threatened twice by the Justice Department to return documents that they said were classified. But these were documents that had been released to me by the Attorney General under the Carter administration, Attorney General Civiletti. So I never returned the documents because they were unclassified when they were given to me. And what the Reagan administration did was reclassify them as top secret and then order that I give them back. But we found a passage in the executive order on secrecy that said once a document's been declassified, it can't be reclassified. So then Reagan changed the executive order to say that it could be reclassified, but they couldn't apply it in my case because of the principle of ex post facto. So that was fairly dramatic, where they were threatening me during the writing of The Puzzle Palace. But, you know, ironically, the second book I had on NSA after that, Body of Secrets, they had a book signing for me at NSA. I interviewed, you know, the director in his office and had tours of the agency and all that, everything else. But then when I discovered that NSA was doing all this illegal warrantless eavesdropping, I wrote the third book, which was The Shadow Factory, showing how NSA got involved in all this illegal activity after they had basically given it up for many years, ever since the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court was created in around 1978. So, you know, I've had sort of a love-hate relationship with NSA over the years, but so sometimes I'll compliment them if they do something good, and other times I'll criticize them, as I do in this article, for things that I don't think they're doing very good.
James Bamford, can you say what your response is to the way in which the Obama administration has dealt with this issue as against how the Bush administration did? What differences there are, if any?
Well, I haven't seen a lot of differences. President Obama, for example, when all the furor broke out over the warrantless eavesdropping during the Bush administration, came out and said that he was totally against that. He was going to vote against changing the law to allow that kind of thing, and also to vote against giving immunity to the telecom companies. The telecom companies could have been charged with a crime for violating everybody's privacy. But then when push came to shove and it came time to vote, he didn't. He voted opposite to what he said, and he voted for the legislation, sort of creating this warrantless eavesdropping change to the law that he said he was previously against, which basically legalized what the Bush administration had been doing in their warrantless eavesdropping. And he also voted against, or he voted in favor of giving immunity to the telecom companies, which is, again, opposite of what he said previously. And now he's, you know, the president here the last 3 years, while they've been building this enormous, or at least completing this enormous infrastructure, and they hadn't even started this when he became president, the large data center in Bluffdale. So I don't really see an awful lot of difference between the two in terms of what's going on with NSA. If anything, it's gotten much larger under Obama than it was under Bush.
James Bamford, we're going to ask you to stay with us. He's speaking to us from London, investigative reporter who wrote The Puzzle Palace, Shadow Factory, now a piece in Wired called The NSA is Building the Country's Biggest Spy Center. Watch what you say, because we're going to be joined by two whistleblowers. One of them, if he had stood trial, Thomas Drake, who worked at the NSA, possibly Jim Bamford would have testified at that trial. We'll also be joined by Jesselyn Reddick, who took on the Justice Department, particularly around the case of John Walker Lynn, who is still in prison. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. We'll be back in less than a minute. No Government by Nicolette, here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh. We turn now to whistleblowers and the unprecedented attack they've come under during the Obama administration. Evoking the Espionage Act of 1917, the administration's pressed criminal charges against no fewer than 6 government employees, more than all previous presidential administrations combined. Their crime, leaking classified information to reporters. Last Last month, Jake Tapper, the White House correspondent for ABC News, questioned the Obama administration for applauding truth seekers abroad while simultaneously prosecuting them at home. Tapper raised his concerns shortly after White House Press Secretary Jay Carney lamented the deaths of journalists Anthony Shadid and Marie Colvin, saying they'd given their lives in order to bring truth while reporting in Syria. This is reporter Jake Tapper.
How does that square with the fact that this administration has been so aggressively trying to stop aggressive journalism in the United States by using the Espionage Act to take whistleblowers to court? You're currently, I think that you've invoked it the 6th time, and before the Obama administration it had only been used 3 times in history. This is the 6th time you're suing a CIA officer for allegedly providing information in 2009 about CIA torture. Certainly that's something that's in the public interest of the United States. This administration is taking this person to court. There just seems to be a disconnect here. You want aggressive journalism abroad, you just don't want it in the United States.
Well, I would hesitate to speak to any particular case for obvious reasons, and I would refer you to the Department of Justice for more on that.
That was Jay Carney. Now, a former top spokesman for the Justice Department, Matthew Miller, seems to be reversing his stance on the prosecution of National Security Agency whistleblower Thomas Drake. Drake was initially charged under the Espionage Act for leaking information about waste mismanagement at the agency, but the case against him later collapsed. In a recent exchange with political correspondent Josh Gerstein, Miller said the Drake case was legitimate, unlike some others. He wrote, quote, "Drake did seem to be trying to expose actual government waste. I think the outcome of the case probably shows that it was an ill-considered choice for prosecution." Miller had previously defended the prosecution of Thomas Drake. He was quoted in the New York Times as saying, quote, "It's an important principle that people who have access to classified information follow the law and the agreements they have signed to protect that information." Miller also said the indictment was brought on the merits and nothing else. As recently as this month, Miller had mounted one of the first public defenses of the Obama administration's unprecedented prosecution of alleged leakers. His piece in the Daily Beast is called "Obama is Right to Prosecute Leakers Who Are Not the Same as Whistleblowers." In the piece, Miller claims, quote, "Leaks of classified information can endanger American soldiers and intelligence officers and expose sensitive national security programs to our enemies. Whistleblowers expose violations of law, abuse of authority, or a substantial and specific threat to public health or safety."
Those are the words of the former top spokesman for the Justice Department, Matthew Miller. Well, for more, we're joined by Thomas Drake himself. He's here in New York City for the Brennan Center and the Government Accountability Project discussion on national security whistleblowers. Drake's the winner of the 2011 Ridenour Prize for Truth-Telling and co-recipient of the Sam Adams Associates for Integrity and Intelligence Award. And we're continuing with Jim Bamford in London, who was hired by the Drake defense team as an expert witness in his case. In addition, we're joined by Thomas Drake's attorney, Jessalyn Radek, a former ethics advisor to the U.S. Department of Justice. Also a whistleblower. She's currently the Director of National Security and Human Rights at the Government Accountability Project, the nation's leading whistleblower organization, and she has a book out, which is called Traitor, the Whistleblower and the American Taliban. Thomas Drake, Jessalyn Radek, and Jim Bamford, again, thanks so much all for joining us. Thomas Drake, talk about what happened in your case. What did you do? What were you charged with? And how are you sitting here today?
Well, I sit here as a free man. I was charged under the Espionage Act as part of an indictment that was handed down on me in April of 2010. There was 5 counts under the Espionage Act for retaining, not leaking, retaining national defense information. The government alleged that I was doing so for the purpose of disclosure to those unauthorized to receive it. I was also charged with obstruction of justice as well as making false statements to FBI agents.
Talk about what it was, what kind of information you are charged with keeping and why you are called a whistleblower. What information did you want to get out? What were the problems you saw at the NSA, and how long did you work there?
At the NSA, I worked there for almost 7 years. Yeah, I was actually hired in from the outside. It was a special program that General Hayden had sponsored. There was a lot of pressure from stakeholders, particularly in Congress. The NSA was too insular. It was hiring from within, promoting from within. They needed to bring in fresh blood, stir up the gene pool, as it were. And so about a dozen of us were hired in from the outside during about a 6-month period in 2001 prior to 9/11.
What'd you find?
Well, my first day on the job was 9/11, and it was shortly after 9/11 that I was exposed to the Pandora's box of illegality and government wrongdoing on a very significant scale. So you had the twin fraud, waste, the twin specters of fraud, waste, and abuse being committed on a vast scale through a program called Trailblazer, a multi-billion-dollar program, when in fact there was alternatives that already existed and fulfilled most all the requirements of Trailblazer, even prior to 9/11.
What did Trailblazer do?
Trailblazer was ostensibly the flagship program that Hayden said, we're going to go out to American industry and buy it. We're not going to make it. We're not going to take the best of American ingenuity and innovation. We're just simply going to go to the defense contractors and let them figure out how to meet the demands of the digital age. The digital age was a significant challenge for NSA. It was having great difficulty not only making sense of the vast streams of data that were pouring in from all over, but also figuring out what was going on. Essentially what was happening is NSA was going blind. It was going deaf.
Can you talk about the other program, Thin Thread, and how it related to what Trailblazer did, and why the NSA chose Trailblazer, in fact, instead of Thin Thread? Well, a lot of money's involved. I mean, NSA, you talk about, the corporate and the military-industrial complex. We're talking about upwards of a $4 billion program. Thin Thread actually was a skunkworks program. It was actually a very small group of individuals who, during the 90s, said, you know what, we're going to figure out how to deal with the digital age. We're going to figure out how to make sense of large streams of data. We're going to figure out how to maintain the fidelity and integrity of what it is that we collect. And we're going to make sense out of it at the same time. And they actually solved the heart of that problem. It was a challenge problem for NSA. They solved the heart of it. It was only a $7 million solution prior to 9/11. And it was ready for operational deployment prior to 9/11. It was rejected by NSA. The critical thing that I discovered was not just the massive fraud, waste, and abuse, but also the fact that NSA had chosen to ignore a 23-year legal regime, which had been established in 1978 called the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, with the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, and which at NSA, during the time that I was not only NSA but also in the military, flying on RC-135s overseas during the latter part of the Cold War, it was a contract. The one thing you did not do, it was the prime directive of NSA. It was the First Amendment at NSA, which is you do not spy on Americans.
And what'd you find?
Without a warrant. I found, much to my horror, that they had tossed out that legal regime. That it was the excuse of 9/11, which I was told was exigent conditions now prevailed. We essentially can do anything. We opened up Pandora's box. We're going to turn the United States of America into the equivalent of a foreign nation for the purpose of dragnet, blanket electronic surveillance.
So in other words, now warrantless wiretapping of U.S. citizens by the NSA and other intelligence agencies is legal?
Well, there was series of legislation that Justin Raddick can probably best to address the legality of this. But later on, once the fact of warrantless wiretapping came out in the press, and the James Rise and Eric Liplow article in December of 2005, which launched a major DOJ national security investigation, which I ultimately got caught up. Yes, during that whole period, we're talking a very, very super secret program, which is actually referenced, that program is referenced in James Bamford's blockbuster article, and it's a lead article in Wired magazine for the month of April. That particular program was, in fact, violating on a vast scale the Fourth Amendment rights of U.S. citizens. It didn't matter. It was just used as an excuse that the fair game that NSA had, the legitimate ability of NSA to collect in foreign intelligence from overseas, well, now that capability is being used to collect against U.S. citizens and everybody else in the United States of America.
And Thomas Drake, when you raised this to your higher-ups, your supervisors, your superiors at the NSA, what did they say?
Well, I went specifically to Maureen Baginski with my concerns.
Who is?
She, at the time, was the Signals Intelligence Director, the #3 person at NSA. And she had rejected the Thin Thread solution out of hand, said they had gone with a different solution. They didn't need it anymore. And I kept pressing her hard. I said, we're violating the law. We cannot do this. And she said, if you have a problem with it, take it up with the Office of General Counsel. I was specifically told by the Office of General Counsel and one of the attorneys, senior attorneys there named Vito Potenza, that it had all been approved by the White House. NSA was the executive agent, and it was all legal. And I knew in that moment I could no longer remain complicit, and I could not serve as an accomplice into the subversion of our own Constitution.
So what'd you do?
I started blowing the whistle within, and I started blowing the whistle with two 9/11 congressional investigations, as well as a multi-year Department of Defense Inspector General audit investigation in which I, as a whistleblower, was an unnamed senior official, along with Diane Rourke, Ed Loomis, Kirk Wiebe, and Bill Binney.
And what happened?
They launched a formal audit investigation regarding the requirements for Thin Thread and Trailblazer. And
they also launched an investigation of you.
Well, that investigation, actually, essentially enough, was a result of a Department of Justice criminal national security investigation to find the quote-unquote sources for the New York Times article written by Lichtblau and Reisen. And that's ultimately how I was caught up. Prior to my indictment, they were convinced that I had something to do with that article, when in fact I didn't. And so I did have contact with a reporter from the Baltimore Sun, in which I actually gave unclassified information regarding the fact that there was a legal alternative to the secret program that had been approved by the White House in concert between Hayden and Cheney, a piece of paper, a memo that was written by John Yoo, held by David Addington in a safe in the White House. And so I ended up, also talking to that reporter about the significant fraud, waste, and abuse, okay, beyond just Trailblazer, because she had written a series of articles, but also the fact that there was this legal alternative, which would not only provide superior intelligence to the United States of America, but also would have done so completely honoring the Fourth Amendment and fully compliant with FISA.
Jesselyn Ruddock, you represent Thomas Drake, and you're a whistleblower yourself within the Justice Department. We only have a minute, but we're going to continue this conversation online at democracynow.org. Talk about the significance of Thomas Drake's case and ultimately what ended up being the charge.
Ultimately, all 10 felony counts were dropped, and he ended up pleading guilty to a minor misdemeanor for exceeding the authorized use of a government computer, which is like using Facebook too much while you're at work. The significance is that he was the fourth person in U.S. history to be charged under the Espionage Act. The first, tellingly, was Daniel Ellsberg. And now there are 6 people. The most recent to be charged is John Kiriakou. And all of these people are not spies. They're whistleblowers, and they're the people who revealed torture and warrantless wiretapping, some of the biggest scandals that occurred in my generation.
How do you explain the unprecedented prosecution of whistleblowers and leakers under the Obama administration?
Really, I think it's a way to create terrible precedent to go after journalists, and a backdoor way to create an Official Secrets Act, which we've managed to live without in this country for more than 200 years. And I think it's being done on the backs of whistleblowers, and it's also meant to send a very chilling message to government employees not to speak out about fraud, waste, abuse, and patent illegality.
We're going to leave it there, but we're going to continue this conversation. Part 2 will appear soon online today at democracynow.org. Our guests have been Jesselyn Ruddock, Director of National Security and Human Rights at the Government Accountability Project. Her new book is called Traitor, The Whistleblower and the American Taliban. And we've been joined by Thomas Drake here on Democracy Now!, NSA whistleblower. And thanks also to James Bamford. A very special happy birthday to Miriam Barnard. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh. Thanks for joining us.